Okay, I think we're connected. We'll be starting in less than a minute. Got a few people tuned in already. Okay, let's begin. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato sama sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato sama sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato sama sambuddhassa. So, for the next three of these talks, I want to deal with the triple gem, the three refuges, Buddha, Dhamma, Sangha, and try and put them into some kind of context, so they're not just empty words. And we'll begin with the Buddha today. The word Buddha means awake, awakened one, and it's not a name. It's a statement of the condition of the man Siddhartha Gautama after his enlightenment or awakening experience under the Bodhi tree. When we think about the Buddha, there are at least two aspects that we should be keeping in mind simultaneously. This is summed up by the Zen master Dogen, who said, "If you see the old man Shakyamuni, do you see the Tathagata? If you see the Tathagata, do you see the old man Shakyamuni?" The old man Shakyamuni refers to the specific historical individual who is known in the Pali sources as Siddhartha Gautama, and the Tathagata is the enlightened one. And these two exist simultaneously. And throughout Buddhist history, there have been leanings or shiftings to one aspect or the other. In late Indian Buddhism, in some of the Mahayana traditions, the old man Shakyamuni was lost sight of altogether, and the Buddha was perceived as a kind of a deity, a godlike figure. The biographical details of his life were said to be just a fable. He existed from time immemorial as an enlightened being and manifested in some form on the earth. In one text, Mahayana text, it said that he just appeared seated on a lotus blossom in a golden pavilion, and for 40 years sat there without moving and uttering a single note. And the arahants were those beings who had sufficient spiritual development to interpret the meaning hidden within that note. And that included all the teachings of the Buddha, including his life story, which was just a teaching fable. So, this is one extreme. And in some modern interpretations, go to the other extreme, and we have images of the Buddha or depictions of the Buddha as just basically a very wise philosopher, just an ordinary person who kind of figured things out on his own, losing sight altogether of the transcendental or spiritual aspect. I would include Deepak Chopra's biography of the Buddha in this category. That's well worth, it's a little book. It's well worth picking up just to see a totally modernist interpretation of the Buddha and his life, and which really has very little relation to the original sources. It's entirely a modernist kind of imagination. So let's begin looking at the human man, Siddhartha Gautama. And here we need to have some discretion to separate historical reality from myths and fables that surrounded this figure in later times. There certainly was a man, an individual born into a specific historical, social, political context in northern India, actually in what's now Nepal, but in the Indian cultural area. And the actual details of his life before his enlightenment that we have from the Pali sources are very slim. The story that he was the son of a king is probably not a historically accurate depiction, because we know that the Sakyan state was not a kingdom, it was a republic. Now, it may be that the word Raja, which is translated as king, merely meant one holding sovereignty. And in a republic, in a kingdom, that would be one man. In a republic, that would be many. A republic, an ancient Indian republic like the Sakyan, was not a democracy. It was, we would call it an oligarchy. It was governance by the heads of the clans, the elder males of each family grouping. So it was a collective kind of rule. And it may be that Siddhartha Gautama's father was one of these oligarchs. We do have in the original suttas a brief mention. The Buddha said that he was raised in great luxury and ease. So he came from a wealthy family, and he several times identifies himself as being of the Katiya caste. That's Sanskrit is Kshatriya. This is the warrior noble caste. So he came from the upper crust, the nobility of the time. And we know a bit more about him. If we want to stick just to the canonical sources, we know a bit more about his life after he left home, and that he spent 6 years practicing extreme austerities. This was in the Indian tradition, the Samana tradition of the time, which is basically shamanism. Now, Samana, shaman is from the same root. And this tradition was probably pre-Aryan. It was probably indigenous Indian tradition. whereas you see this phrase often in the suttas, we're speaking about holy men collectively as samanas and brahmins. The samanas were the ascetic wanderers, the yogis, and they would represent the indigenous or Dravidian, the spiritual or religious um, uh, stream, and the Brahmins were the priests who were ritualistic followers of the Vedic tradition. So that this was the Aryan tradition that came in from from north of India. The Buddha himself, by identifying himself as a Kshatriya, we can assume that he was from one of those Aryan clans. And we have some stories in the Vinaya about the Sakyas and their political relations. And it seems like they were very proud of the purity of their caste. They were up in the north of India, so that would have been kind of a backwater. So they would have been old-fashioned, and sticking to the older tradition that was being changed and modernized, you might say, in the Ganges Valley, where the Buddha, after his enlightenment, spent most of his time in the commercial dynamic civilization of the Ganges River. We have some indication in the sources of the personality, the human personality of Siddhartha Gautama, even after his enlightenment. We can see here and there peeking out through the formalism of the texts, we can see that he had a sense of humor. My favorite example is one sutta. The name of the sutta escapes me at the moment, but it's in the Majjhima Nikaya, where the Buddha is speaking with Ananda, and he's recounting his austerities. And this is a primary source for our information about his 6 years of seeking. And at the time that this was spoken, both him and Ananda were old men. This was towards near the end of the Buddha's lifetime. And he's telling Ananda about the extremities he went to. And at one point he says that, talking about his extreme fasting that he undertook, he said, I limited myself to 1 handful of rice a day. Then I limited myself to just 10 grains of rice, then just 5 grains. Then finally I limited myself to a single grain of rice every day. And you may think, Ananda, that in those days rice grains were larger than they are now, but that is not so. If anything, they were just the same size. At most, they were just the same size. So you can just imagine, these 2 old men and the Buddha with a twinkle in his eye, recounting the old days and having a bit of fun with that. We can see that the Buddha also was very, very skilled as a teacher. That he was able to formulate his teaching in a very precise and evocative way. And the forms of his teaching varies. The content is remarkably consistent, but he uses different forms. Sometimes it's a very specific, dry, technical exposition. Sometimes he uses something that is very close to what's called in the West the Socratic method of questions and answers. And sometimes very often, he uses parables and metaphors. Some of them are quite colorful and memorable. We also see a great deal of compassion and patience, and this comes through very much in the Vinaya texts. When you consider that every Vinaya rule that's laid down was a response to specific incidents, the Buddha shows remarkable wisdom and patience in dealing with what were sometimes quite foolish and unruly disciples. One thing we should not do, one thing we should be careful about is not to uh, not to impose our present day cultural biases onto the Buddha and his milieu. And this is something we sometimes see in modern writings, that um, people have taken an unhistorical approach, that they're unable to release their imagination from their own cultural biases and try and understand the Buddha and his teachings in the cultural, historical circumstances in which he lived. Now, the actual contents of the Dhamma are timeless; they're akalical. They apply in ancient India as they do today, but the forms and the the outer trappings, we might say, of the teaching are specific to a time and a place. And I think you can get a deeper level of understanding of the suttas if you read them with that uh, in mind and try and imaginatively place yourself in ancient India. And the basic assumptions of the people and their cultural relations were uh, in many ways quite different from what they are today. And we still sticking for the moment to the historical figure of the Buddha. He is a refuge even in his human aspect, because he is the founder. We wouldn't be here today. We wouldn't have the Dhamma today without his enlightenment, and then his decision to teach, and his genius in formulating the Dhamma in such a way that it has survived remarkably for 2,500 years. When you think of it, that's actually quite a astonishing thing, that this body of teaching has survived uh, so well preserved for so long. This is contribution of this man, Siddhartha Gautama. But he wasn't just Siddhartha Gautama. He wasn't just a compassionate, wise philosopher. He was a Buddha. He was awakened. And this is quite important. When he was, shortly after his enlightenment, he was sitting under a tree and resting as on a journey, and a wanderer came by and saw he looked quite remarkable. Shortly after his enlightenment, he must have looked quite luminous, and said, "Are you a Dewa?" "No, I'm not a Dewa." "Are you a human being?" "No, I'm not a human being." "What are you then?" "I am Buddha," which literally means I am awake. Now, this is little snippet of text is interesting in a couple of ways. One is that this is one of the rare times in which he refers to himself as Buddha. Usually, he refers to himself as Tathagata, the thus come or thus gone, and his followers usually refer to him as Bhagawa, the Blessed One. It's kind of an oddity that which I don't really fully understand how it came about. That of all the titles of this individual, that the one titled Buddha is the one that's universally known and applied now. But it is there. It means the awakened one. And on the this accomplishment is something beyond the ordinary human experience, which is why he denied he's a human being, because he's no longer, although he was, in one sense, still a human being till the day he died. He suffered in his last days. He suffered ordinary human aging and ailments. He had transcended the ordinary human condition by completely purifying his being to the depth and becoming Buddha, awakened. And this transcends his singular personality, because a Buddha is also an archetype, and that there's not just one Buddha. There's an infinity of Buddhas in beginningless time. One Buddha arising at rare intervals in the world. In this particular world system, there's said to be 5, of which Siddhartha Gautama is number 4, and the one yet to come is Maitreya. But before this world system existed, there were many previous Buddhas, and every Buddha has the same realization, although they're all different individuals, and we don't know a lot about previous Buddhas. We have a few stories about Kassapa Buddha, the one just before Gautama, and we have some story about the Pankara Buddha, who lived, I think it was 92 kappas ago, and he's the one that the being who would eventually become Siddhartha Gautama after countless rebirths. One that the being who would eventually become Siddhartha Gautama after countless rebirths made his aspiration to become a Buddha. And this is one meaning of the word Bhagawa, blessed, because every Buddha has been blessed by a previous Buddha at some time in the very distant past on another world system. And every Buddha repeats the same archetypal experience of awakening. There's a number of specific details about a Buddha's life that are repeated with each Buddha. That every Buddha, or I should say Bodhisattva, before he becomes the Buddha, every Bodhisattva, after his birth, his mother dies within 7 days, and every Buddha has 2 chief disciples, and on and on. There's quite a list. And this archetypal repetition, there's a charming story in the commentary about the Bodhisattva just before his enlightenment. After he'd been given by the milkmaid Sujata, he'd been given a bowl of rice, milk rice. And when he finished, he put the dish it was in, he put it in the river. He was next to a small river. He put it in the river and he made the aspiration, if I am to attain supreme enlightenment this very night, may this bowl float upstream against the current. And it did. It floated for some distance upstream, and then it sank. And when it sank, it landed with a clink on a pile of 3 bowls that were already there from the 3 previous Buddhas, who had sat at the same place and made the same aspiration, floated their bowl up the river. And there was an ancient Naga sleeping at the bottom of the river. And when he heard the clink, he woke up momentarily and said, oh, I guess there's another Buddha arising in the world. Doesn't seem so long. And this story is just kind of a charming detail, but it expresses the idea that the arising of a Buddha is an archetypal event. It's a universal cosmic event that occurs. There are, in the whole history of the earth, there are many beings who attain some degree of enlightenment, and Arahants has the same understanding of the Dhamma, the same penetration of Nibbana as a Buddha. But there's something more with a Buddha. The Buddha has completed all the 10 paramis to utter perfection. And he has completely transcended his own human nature. He's seen through it. One of the descriptions of the Enlightenment Night has the Buddha going through 3 phases, the T-Widya, the 3 knowledges, which itself, just a side note, that the word T-Widya is itself a play on words, which is something the Buddha often did, using a cultural context, because this refers to the 3 Vedas. It's the same root, and an ancient Indian would have recognized that right away. So the T-Widya of the Buddha, the first watch of the night, he recalled all his past lives, going back hundreds of thousands of ages of time. So this is like a complete, exhaustive self-examination, a complete plumbing of the depths of the psyche. It's like a psychoanalysis that's gone to a transcendental level, so that his entire karmic history was laid bare, going back aeons and aeons and aeons of time. So that was all illuminated. Then in the second watch of the night, he took that personal understanding and made it universal. And he saw the workings of samsara. He saw the workings of karma. He saw how all beings are going up and down in the circle of samsara, rising here and falling and rising somewhere else, and going up to higher states or down to lower states, just constantly churning in this vast wheel of samsara. So he's gone beyond the purely personal. Then in the third watch of the night, he attained the Buddhahood, and this is described in this text as the exhaustion of the asavas, the root defilements. So he utterly purified his being. This is really important, and I think, just using that phrase doesn't capture the incredible profundity of what occurred. A complete purification of his being. So nothing left, no shadows left in the subconscious. illuminated through and through. There is no more subconscious for an enlightened being. His entire being is luminous, is clear, crystal clear. This is Buddha. So he transcends the human. But you could also say that this is the perfection of human. This is uh, this is what human beings would be if they had no defilements and um, dark spaces in their psyche. This is the most natural state of human being. So it's really impossible for us to imagine or appreciate what the mind of the Buddha would be like. We can just perhaps have a glimpse of it. The Buddha himself said one of the things that will drive you mad if you try and figure it out is the depth of the understanding of a Tathagata. An ordinary person cannot understand the depth of the Buddha's enlightenment or his knowledge, which didn't stop the commentators. And in later times, there was a great deal of discussion about uh, what's the Buddha's Sabanyuto, and all knowledge, his omniscience. What does it mean if the Buddha was omniscient? And we see that word Sabanyuto is used often in the Jatakas. That the Bodhisattva is said to be striving for Sabanyuto. And I think we see this kind of a tendency in the commentaries. And the Buddha says something can't be numbered. They try and figure out the number anyway. He said you can't know the depth of penetration of a Buddha. The commentators tried to figure that out anyway. The definition they came up with, for what it's worth, is that the Buddha didn't know all things at once immediately, but he could know anything he chose if he applied his mind to it. And they give the example of the number of fish in the Ganges River. He'd have no reason to know that, but if for some reason he did want to know, if somebody asked him or he for some reason needed to know that, he could just apply his mind and he would come up with the answer. But these are all this is kind of, to me, it's kind of an intellectual game, trying to figure out the mind of a Buddha. It's something that by its very nature is transcendent to our mind. It's like a dog or a cat trying to figure out an ordinary human being's mind. It's not really possible. You can't understand a level of you can't fully understand a level of consciousness higher than your own. So the transcendental aspect of the Buddha as a refuge is we have this refuge of as an example and as a potential. Like anyone can eventually, in many lifetimes, become a Buddha. It's not. It's certainly not. In the Theravada tradition, the attainment of Buddhahood is considered extremely rare. It's many whole ages of the world can go by without a Buddha arising. And some of the later Mahayana traditions, they multiplied the number of Buddhas, and even there's a saying in Zen, all beings are Buddhas from beginningless time. And I think, there is kind of a meaning to that, in that the potential or the seed of a Buddhahood is there. Consciousness, chitta, is inherently pure, but it's defiled and it's hidden. And if that is completely uncovered, then there's a realization of enlightenment. So you could perhaps see this as another aspect of the refuge of Buddhahood, as Buddhahood as not referring to a specific individual or even to a repeated archetype, but as a universal principle or potential, a transcendent idea. And it's a very beautiful idea and something we contemplate and take refuge in. It brightens our mind and our heart. So I'll offer those few thoughts on the nature of the Buddha, and I'll go to the questions and answers. Let's see what we got here. Is emptiness just another term for essencelessness, or is there something more to it? Well, I would. Oh, okay, it's the second part to this. Will merely believing in dependent origination but not realizing it lead to higher heavenly rebirth? Uh, is emptiness just another term for essencelessness? Well, essencelessness, or lack of a self-substance or a swabhava, is one way of understanding emptiness. Um, Another way is the relationship of one thing to another, that nothing exists from its own side. Everything is dependently arisen. Dependent origination is a way of understanding that. So the idea of emptiness or sunyata can be approached from these different angles. Um, uh, and merely believing in dependent origination but not realizing it, does it lead to a higher heavenly rebirth? Well, it means you have right view, although on a mundane level, which would tend to a human or heavenly rebirth, depending on many other factors. I mean, if you're keeping good sila and so on. Aaron, greetings in Sault Ste. Marie, Northern California. Somebody else, okay. Question: if the writers of the text didn't even know the Buddha grew up in a republic rather than a kingdom, how accurate do you think the rest of the things are in the suttas to the historical Buddha? Well, the suttas never mention him being the son of a king. This is from a later period when India itself was becoming more monarchical in general. So it's like it's kind of similar kind of thing we see in the West. People can be historically naive and fall into the error of presentism. You see, and I'm thinking a Western example is you see Renaissance paintings of biblical stories or stories from ancient Rome or Greece, and they're all dressed in Renaissance clothing. If people are not historically minded, they just kind of assume that what they see around them is the natural state of things. So when these stories about the Buddha's life were elaborated, that India was already much more monarchical. The original were more republics. What is meant by boundless consciousness? That's consciousness. That's the state, the second formless abiding. That's consciousness without limit. I've heard one speculative interpretation of the state of boundless consciousness that I'll give it for what it's worth. I'm kind of interested in this interpretation, but I'm not sure I completely agree with it. Is that it's what the Upanishads understood as the universal mind, and the Brahman being the same as Atman. But what it refers to, that's kind of a speculative interpretation, linking two different streams of thought. But in the Buddhist context, it means consciousness that's not bound by place and limited by time and circumstance, but is completely open in all directions. Two common views of Buddhahood: rare, special, unprecedented; ordinary and non-Buddhas, overlooking something always here. Can we talk about these two aspects according to primary sources? Yeah. Well, rephrasing your question, that the two views of Buddhahood is either something very rare and special, or as something ordinary. And this is the Zen idea. We're all Buddhas from beginningless time, but basically we just don't know it. We're obstructed by the defilements. We don't realize our own Buddhahood. I think the Theravada tradition is very much leaned towards the idea of Buddhahood being something special and out of the ordinary, something rare and extraordinary. And